Now let us turn to the Hadith collections themselves, the backbone of Islamic law, the source of over 80% of Islamic jurisprudence, the foundation upon which Muslim practice is built. But how reliable are these collections? Let us examine the facts. The Sunnis and the Shiites follow different Hadith collections. We will focus on Sunni Hadiths since over 80% of all Muslims are Sunni. Sunni Islam has 6 topically arranged Hadith collections: Bukhari, Muslim, Abu Dawood, Ibn Majah, Tirmidhi, and Al-Nasa'i, with Bukhari's collection being the most highly esteemed, followed by Muslim's Hadith collection. Now here is the critical question. When was Bukhari born? Bukhari was born in the year 194 AH, which is over 180 years after Muhammad died. Let that sink in. Over 180 years. That is over 100 years later than Ibn Ishaq, who was earliest biographer of Muhammad, and about 28 years before the historian Al-Tabari was born. So the most trusted Hadith collector in all of Sunni Islam lived nearly 2 centuries after the events he is recording. And the problem of geographic, cultural, and linguistic distance. But the problem is not just time. Let us ask another critical question. Where did Muhammad live? Muhammad lived in the Hijaz region of Arabia, in Mecca and Medina. He spoke Arabic, specifically the dialect of the Quraysh tribe. He lived among Arab tribal culture in the early 7th century. Now, let me ask, where did Bukhari live? Bukhari was born in Bukhara, in present-day Uzbekistan, over 2,500 miles away from Mecca. That is the distance from New York to Los Angeles. Different region, different culture, different dialect, over 2 centuries removed. Where did Muslim Ibn al-Hajjaj live? He lived in Nishapur, in present-day Iran, over 1,500 miles from Medina. Again, different place, different culture, different time. So let me summarize. The people recording the most authoritative traditions about Muhammad lived over 180 years after him, lived thousands of miles away from where he lived in different cultures, spoke different dialects, had no direct access to the events, had no written records to verify the oral traditions they received. Now pause and think about that. How reliable can oral transmission be across 180 years, 2,500 miles, multiple cultures, and different languages? And remember, this is not written transmission. This is oral transmission. The Isnad system is a verification of oral reliability, not written reliability. So let me ask, in the context of 7th, 8th, and 9th century Arabia and Persia, when most people could not read or write, how do you verify oral reports about events that happened nearly 2 centuries earlier? You cannot go back and check a written record. There is no archive. There is no library of documents. There is only the chain of people who claim to have heard it from someone, who heard it from someone, who heard it from someone. And in such a context, one can make up anything and call it reliable, because there is nothing to verify it against. No contemporary written sources, no independent documentation, just names in a chain. This is confirmed by Bukhari's own admission. Now listen carefully to what the introduction to Muhammad Muhsin Khan's translation of Sahih al-Bukhari says. It is said that Imam Bukhari collected over 300,000 hadiths, and he himself memorized 200,000, of which some were unreliable. He was born at a time when hadith was being forged, either to please rulers or kings, or to corrupt the religion of Islam. It was a great task for him to sift the forged hadiths from the authentic ones. He labored day and night, and although he had memorized such a large number, he only chose approximately 7,275, of which there is no doubt about their authority. Did you catch that? Bukhari examined 300,000 hadiths. He accepted approximately 7,275. That means he rejected over 292,000 hadiths. Let me ask, what does that tell you about the reliability of the oral tradition? Bukhari considered all but about 3% of the traditions he heard to be questionable. Only 3%. Given such a state of affairs, how can we have confidence in any of these traditions? Especially since the criteria by which Bukhari evaluated whether or not a hadith was reliable was based solely upon the integrity of the alleged chain of transmitters, known as the Isnad, and the reputation of the narrators, known as Adl. So let me ask Muslims directly. If 97% of the hadiths circulating in Bukhari's time were fabricated or unreliable, how do you know the remaining 3% are authentic? What if Bukhari got it wrong? What if he accepted a fabricated hadith and rejected an authentic one? On what basis do you trust his judgment? And given that he lived 180 years later, 2,500 miles away, in a different culture and language, how could he possibly verify the authenticity of these oral reports? The unreliability of oral transmission without written verification. Here's the fundamental problem. In a context where there are no contemporary written records, where transmission is purely oral, where the collectors live centuries later and thousands of miles away, where 97% of circulating traditions are acknowledged fabrications, you can say literally anything about Muhammad and call it authentic. You can say Muhammad believed in Jesus, that he died and rose again, conquering death. Or you can say he did not. You can say he spoke by Satan. Or you can say he did not. You can say he was bewitched and imagine things that did not happen, as recorded in Sahih al-Bukhari 5765 and Sahih Muslim 2189. Or you can deny it. We cannot be absolutely certain of anything because there is no independent written verification. But according to Islamic tradition and history, this is the actual state of Muhammad, his life, and the Quran, which depends on him. The sources say, he spoke by Satan. Ibn Ishaq Sirah, al-Tabari's tafsir on Surah 22, ayat 52. He was bewitched. Sahih al-Bukhari 5765, Sahih Muslim 2189. He married his adopted son's wife. Quran Surah 33, ayat 37, Sahih al-Bukhari 4787, Sahih Muslim 1428. He permitted relations with married women whose husbands were alive. Quran Surah 4, ayat 24, Sahih Muslim 1456. So the question is, can we trust such sources? And if we cannot trust the sources, how can we trust Islam? The answer is clear. Everything is absolutely unreliable. Now let's see if the classification system of hadith, are they reliable? Muslims classify hadiths based on their isnads as follows. Sahih means sound. This is the highest classification. Hasan means good, but not as good as Sahih. Da'if means weak hadith, caused by an incomplete isnad or perceived unreliability of one or more of the reporters in the isnad. Madu means a hadith that is suspected of being a forgery. Hadiths which have multiple isnad chains are considered more reliable and are called mutawatir, or corroborated. Yet, corroborated hadiths have the same problems as other hadiths. Ibn Ishaq, who composed his biography long before Bukhari, often has 3 or more links in his chains. An example of Ibn Hisham's Sirah would be like Salih ibn Kaysan from Urwa ibn al-Zubair from Aisha. Al-Tabari's history often has about 5 people in the chain. For example, Ali ibn Nasr, ibn Ali al-Jadami, and Abd al-Warith, ibn Abd al-Samad, ibn Abd al-Warith, from Abd al-Samad ibn Abd al-Warith, from Aban al-Attar, from Hisham ibn Urwa, from Urwa. Now here is the problem. Now let us look at the problems with Isnad chains. First, when one receives a verbal tradition, they only know for certain who told it to them. You cannot verify the integrity of people you never met. You cannot confirm what happened 150 years before you were born. You are dependent entirely on hearsay. Second, if most of Islamic law is determined by the hadith, one needs to know what constitutes authentic hadith in order to determine who was and was not a good Muslim. But that creates a circular problem. You need reliable hadiths to know who was reliable, but you need to know who was reliable to determine which hadiths are reliable. Furthermore, how much information does someone like Bukhari, living 180 years later, 2,500 miles away, in a different culture, really have concerning the character of the people in the chain of transmitters? How does he know they were trustworthy? He is making judgments about people he never met, based on reports from people he never met, about events that happened generations before he was born, in a place he never visited. So I ask, how is this reliable? How is this divine revelation? How can the eternal destiny of souls depend on such a fragile chain? Now it gets even more problematic. According to the Quran, in Surah 2, Ayah 282, a woman's testimony is worth half that of a man. The Quran says, "And called a witness from among your men 2 witnesses. And if 2 men are not at hand, then a man and 2 women, of such as ye approve as witnesses, so that if the one erreth through forgetfulness, the other will remember. So, according to the Quran, women are inherently less reliable witnesses, and this is reinforced in the following Sahih Hadith from Bukhari's collection. Sahih al-Bukhari, Volume 1, Book 6, Hadith 301. Listen to what it says. Narrated Abu Sa'id al-Khudri. Once Allah's apostle went out to the Musalla to offer the prayer of Eid al-Adha, or al-Fitr prayer. Then he passed by the women and said, O women, give alms, as I have seen that the majority of the dwellers of hellfire were you women. They asked, Why is it so, O Allah's apostle? He replied, You curse frequently and are ungrateful to your husbands. I have not seen anyone more deficient in intelligence and religion than you. A cautious, sensible man could be led astray by some of you. The women asked, O Allah's apostle, what is deficient in our intelligence and religion? He said, Is not the evidence of 2 women equal to the witness of 1 man? They replied in the affirmative. He said, This is the deficiency in her intelligence. Isn't it true that a woman can neither pray nor fast during her menses? The women replied in the affirmative. He said, This is the deficiency in her religion. So, according to Muhammad himself, recorded in Sahih al-Bukhari, women are deficient in intelligence and religion. Now, here is the problem. Despite Islam's teachings concerning the unreliability and spiritual deficiency of women, many hadiths originate with a woman and have a woman as the sole link in an Isnad chain. Many hadiths originate with a woman and have no redundancy in the link. If Islam wants to be consistent, they must consider such a link as unreliable. This is a massive problem for Islam, since Aisha alone was a single point of failure on many hadiths. According to Islamic scholars, she narrated 2,210 hadiths, of which 316 hadiths are mentioned in both Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim. So let me ask, if women are deficient in intelligence and their testimony is worth half that of a man, why should we trust hadiths narrated solely by Aisha? Why should we trust hadiths that depend on a single woman as the only link in the chain? Is Islam internally consistent or contradictory? Now here is the most devastating question. Given their trust in the Isnad chain criterion, one must ask, why do modern Muslims reject the New Testament but accept Bukhari's hadith as being authentic? Let us compare. The New Testament writers either had direct access to Jesus. Matthew, one of the 12 apostles, John, one of the 12 apostles, Peter, one of the 12 apostles, James, the brother of Jesus, Paul encountered the risen Christ, Jude, the brother of Jesus. Or they interacted directly with those who had direct access to Jesus. Mark, companion of Peter, Luke, companion of Paul, and interviewer of eyewitnesses. Luke 1, 1-4. Writer of Hebrews, believer with apostolic connection. So the New Testament has short chains of believers with a good reputation. In many cases, 0 intermediaries. Direct eyewitness testimony, written within the lifetimes of the eyewitnesses. Written in the same geographic region where the events occurred. Written in the same cultural and linguistic context. Yet Muslims reject it. But Bukhari? Born 180 years after Muhammad. Born 2,500 miles away from Mecca. Collected traditions that had passed through multiple hands, rejected 97% of what he heard, relied on women narrators despite claiming women are deficient in intelligence, had no written records to verify against. Yet Muslims accept his work as sahih, authentic and reliable. By accepting Bukhari, Muslims are effectively saying that Bukhari knew better than Muhammad. Muhammad said that women are deficient as witnesses, which is why he required 2 women as witnesses. Yet Bukhari accepts the sole testimony of Aisha, thereby contradicting Muhammad's own standard regarding women's reliability as witnesses. If Bukhari rejects Muhammad's standard on this issue and still accepts a single woman's testimony, then how can Muslims fully trust Bukhari and his collection when he appears to reject the Prophet Muhammad's own teaching about witnesses? Should we say Bukhari is better than the great Prophet Muhammad? So let us ask Muslims, by what standard do you reject the New Testament? which has shorter, stronger chains of transmission, while accepting Bukhari, who lived nearly 2 centuries after the events he records. If Isnad is your criterion, the New Testament wins. If eyewitness testimony is your criterion, the New Testament wins. If early dating is your criterion, the New Testament wins. If geographic proximity is your criterion, the New Testament wins. If cultural and linguistic continuity is your criterion, the New Testament wins. So why do you reject it? The irony. And here is the final irony. This problem is compounded by the fact that Bukhari himself believed the Bible was sound. We know this from Sahih al-Bukhari, 7542. Let's read it to know what Bukhari says about Bible. Narrated Abu Huraira. The people of the scripture used to read the Torah in Hebrew and explain it to the Muslims in Arabic. Then Allah's messenger said, "Do not believe the people of the scripture and do not disbelieve them, but say, we believe in Allah and whatever has been revealed." 3.84. Did you notice what Bukhari says? He said we had the Hebrew scriptures, but present Muslims reject this testimony of Bukhari. That is right. The very scholars Sunni Muslims rely upon to evaluate what is and is not a good tradition believe the Bible, the Torah, and the Gospel was authentic and uncorrupted. So even by the standard of your own most trusted Hadith scholar, the Bible is reliable. Yet modern Muslims reject it. Why? Because it contradicts the Quran. Because it exposes Muhammad as a false prophet. Because it undermines the foundation of Islam. So the question remains, on what basis do you trust Islam? On late traditions compiled centuries after the fact? On oral reports transmitted across 2,500 miles away from Muhammad? And 180 years after Muhammad? Why? On circular reasoning about who was reliable? On a system that rejects 97% of its own material? On testimonies from women you claim are deficient in intelligence? On sources that have no written verification? The choice is clear. Everything in Islam, from the life of Muhammad to the Quran itself, rests on an absolutely unreliable foundation.